Welcome everybody to a new Dissecting Design, where in each one I take a deep dive into a specific game and talk about my thoughts on the gameplay and design of it. I usually do these when I kind of am inspired, but if we can hit our first major goal on our Patreon, we'll try and do these monthly with the Patreon supporters voting for which games they want me to dive into. So if you're interested, check out the Patreon link down below. But for this Dissecting Design, for those of you who loved my review of Spelunky 2, I think you're going to get a kick out of this one, as I want to talk about why Dead Cells is a fantastic action game, probably one of the best 2D action games released in the last decade, but it is not a good action roguelike. And I am sure we're going to get a lot of very lovely comments down below with that very statement. But when it comes to Dead Cells, this is perhaps the one action roguelike or roguelike I played over the last 10 years where I spend more time playing it in early access than I did at 1.0 and beyond. And Motion Twin has been supporting this game a lot over its initial release, releasing several free DLCs and at this moment in time, 3 paid expansions. So let's begin with the general gameplay. Dead Cells is an action game through and through. You're able to run, jump, double jump, dodge, and use a variety of weapons. Your goal is to escape the island that you're on that has been taken over by a strange disease and malaise that has caused everything to either die, mutate, or just want to get you to die in very gruesome ways. From an action standpoint, Dead Cells is probably one of the most fluid 2D action games we've played over the past 10 years. Your character is immediately responsive, enemies are very expressive in their animation tells and their style. This has gotten even more fantastic with the expansions that have added in new areas, bosses, and so on. So, the general run of a Dead Cells is a fixed path through specific biomes. You're going to go from the first area, to the gardens, to the ramparts, to the first boss, village, clock tower, second boss, castle, final boss. Get through that all, you officially win the run and you have proven your Dead Cells, moderate skill. And we'll come back to that one later on in this video. One aspect of Dead Cells, or actually there are 2 parts of this game that it does very well or it does differently from other action roguelikes on the market. The first is the weapon diversity. Similar to Gunfire Reborn, Dead Cells weapons are all fixed entities. If I'm using the bleeding sword, that bleeding sword is going to react the same way 1 time, 50 times, 10 million times. The same in Gunfire Reborn, where a scalpel is a scalpel just as the Argus is an Argus. These are known elements that if I see it drop in a run, I know what to expect if I use this weapon or pick this up. Like with Gunfire, the sheer variety of the weapons in terms of their basic utility definitely adds to the moment-to-moment gameplay. There is a legitimate difference if I am using the Nutcracker Hammer versus the Kicking Boots versus going a turret build or a trap build. And all this really works at the moment-to-moment layer. The same thing again for Gunfire. This is one of the aspects that I felt kind of limited Hades' approach. That because your basic weapon doesn't change or you can't swap out in between runs, the run becomes very rigidly defined once you start. Whereas with games like Gunfire, Dead Cells, and even going to deck builders like Monster Train and Slay the Spire, your run is going to grow and change. One area where Dead Cells I think really excels in terms of its weapons is with this idea of synergies or elemental interactions, both between weapons and the environment itself. Over the course of early access into 1.0 and beyond, weapons and gear have been introduced that have or create different properties, such as some of the more popular ones that we've seen: create fire, poison, freeze enemies. But then the game adds stuff such as oil. Oil by itself doesn't do anything, but if you combine oil with any source of fire, it creates a stronger fire that enhances its burn damage. There are weapons and gear that will proc off of if enemies are bleeding, if they're stunned, if they're rooted. And this is, I think, one of the most expansive examples of kind of elemental or effect synergy that I've seen in an action roguelike. This is a game where if there are enemies who are fighting you in a pool of water, if you have an electrical based weapon, you can electrify the entire water. It does not hurt you, by the way, and can cause massive damage to everything that's in that pool of water. You can freeze bodies of water. And there's far more examples of this. As I said with some of the weapons, you can kick enemies off ledges, and the fall damage will, in many cases, just kill even the strongest enemies. And this kind of diversity not only gives the game more variety, but it also makes the different weapons and the different spells stand out far more compared to other action roguelikes, even going as far as, I think, beating Gunfire Reborn in this respect, in terms of how these different weapons can affect the enemies and the environment around them. Now, the other original aspect of Dead Cells, and this is the part that I don't think any other action roguelike, at least to today, has managed to compete with, is the Metroidvania aspect. So the Metroidvania kind of skew in that direction. As I said a minute ago, there is a fixed path that you're going to take when you play Dead Cells. But as you play through, you're going to find runes. These are either hidden off the beaten path, and in many cases just going to be right in the middle that you're going to have to win and unlock. When you unlock them, you gain a new permanent ability. Now, most of these are just keys, as in Power A is used to get past obstacle B, and a new path opens up. But once you get the power to wall run, the game really comes to life in terms of its movement tech and just general agility that the player has. The reason why this is important is that once you start unlocking these new abilities, new routes show up, or new routes become apparent. So the path through Dead Cells suddenly doesn't become as black and white. And this has been made even more apparent with the 3 expansion DLCs that have added in new biomes that kind of can take the place of pre-existing ones. So now with the garden area, there are, I think, at least 2, maybe 3 different biomes that you can go in a completely different direction. Every biome has its own path through, its own treasures, of course new enemies, and so on. And this gets factored into the persistence. And the persistence of Dead Cells is, I think, where things become the most polarized. So, with this game, it definitely leans towards the kind of long-term progression and upgrades of a roguelite. That is, you're unlocking permanent things that will enhance subsequent runs and make those runs easier. Now, of course, the better you are at the game, the more you can kind of punch up without needing those upgrades. But they are there, and they are the primary form of progression. By picking up cells off of enemies and bosses, you'll be able to use these to upgrade your character. The most basic way is upgrading how much gold you retain when you die, as well as your health flask, which gives you more swigs that you can take before you run out. As you fight through the various biomes, you'll find blueprint scrolls. There are normal ones, there are rare ones, boss ones, and you get the picture, that you take back to kind of your progression hub that occurs at the end of each level, which will then unlock those scrolls that you can then spend cells on to then get those gear or that equipment to then show up on future runs. After the game was released, Motion Twin did patch in the option for you to disable gear from appearing on subsequent runs if you don't want it to kind of mess with the probability of what can drop. So if you don't want a crazy weapon or spell to show up, you can just turn that off. I don't know how that affects progression though. So with that said, when we talk about Dead Cells from an action standpoint, your entire strategy and build is going to be dependent on what shows up in a run. Essentially, at this point when we play Dead Cells, your two, broad categories of builds are going to be parry focus or dodge focus or / range. You see, many enemies, especially the later ones, can attack multiple times in a single combo pattern. This means that you can't necessarily dodge it easily, especially if you're dealing with close range. So you have to rely on shields or any item that lets you parry attacks. The parry, of course, not only stuns the enemy, but you can also unlock abilities to let it do more damage, or the shield itself may do something as well. And for close range strategies, you need to get good at the parry times, especially if you want to deal with bosses. Now, in terms of how things develop over the run, Motion Twin has enhanced things in terms of how stats work, and their stat-based system has gone through many revisions from its original version through early access to even 1.0 and beyond. You have 3 stats, and they are represented by the colors red, green, and purple. Every item, weapon, spell that you can equip has a corresponding color or colors. When you enhance a stat by finding scrolls that are randomly placed in a level, it will give you a permanent health boost. Basically, the more you pump into a stat, the less of a boost it gives you. This is to incentivize kind of going for a jack of all trades or building each 3 trait evenly. But as you enhance them, they will also add damage to gear of their respective color. And they're kind of the ultimate or the rarest version of gear is the colorless. And the colorless gear basically means that whatever trait that you have at the highest, that's what that weapon is going to use. There are no double trait gear in this game, meaning that it's going to take both red and green, or green and purple, or anything like those combinations. This is done again to kind of balance just how strong the gear is in a run of Dead Cells. Now, for people who do beat Dead Cells, this game features a very extensive kind of progressive difficulty system, or Ascension mode for those of you who played Slay the Spire. Beat the final boss, and you'll unlock a boss cell. When you equip or activate that boss cell, the run becomes harder. Newer or more dangerous enemies show up in earlier biomes, and more importantly, your ability to heal becomes reduced. In the original version of Dead Cells at 1.0, it was very hard to find healing items in the world. Usually you have to find them behind secret or false walls. With later patches, enemies can now drop healing items, and there are also items that you can equip or gear that can take the place of your healing flask at the expense of one of your slots. But of course, this becomes more and more important as you go up in the boss cells. So, the progression of Dead Cells goes finding cells to unlock new stuff, beating enemies to get those scrolls that give you that opportunity, beat the game, get more boss cells, make it harder, and see how far you can push. And all in all, these are staples of action roguelike design. Again, the entire persistent upgrade system has become standard among a lot of action roguelikes and roguelites. But this is where I feel that Dead Cells begins to lack compared to a lot of the other action roguelikes I've played. And we're going to be discussing that and spending the bulk of our video on that topic, but first, a quick break. And as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out the following books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. Alright, it's time to get to the part of it that'll probably be where we get the controversies. As I said in the first part, Dead Cells is a really solid action game. It feels great to play, and one of the things I really did enjoy about that it did right compared to other 2D Metroidvanias or action roguelikes is that there was enough frames of animation that it felt natural to swing your weapons and to also read enemy tells. A lot of the games I play that don't go this route, they either feature too few frames of animation, so it becomes incredibly hard to basically tell when enemies are going to attack, or they'll oftentimes have very awkward hitboxes, where the enemy will swing, the actual attack is over, and you'll still get hit by the weapon, even though it's behind the character's back at this point. But while Dead Cells is a great action game, the point of our Dissecting Design is to talk about why I don't think it works from a roguelike perspective. And there are several points that I think kind of hurt it in this respect, despite, again, the variety of weapons and things that can happen during a run. And speaking of said weapons, that takes me to the first point. I feel that Dead Cells weapons kind of hurt, or the design and itemization hurt the progression of a run. When we look at other kind of weapon-based games, or weapon-based action roguelikes, your Gunfire Reborns, Enter the Gungeons, and so on, that when you pick up a new weapon, or you're picking up weapons in these games, that they either A, have a very explicit purpose, or B, they're designed in a way that allows you to focus your run on them. So, with a game like Enter the Gungeon, your different guns or different drops, they are incredibly important to how you can play the game, but you're not beholden to them. A key element of anyone who's played Enter the Gungeon knows that if you're not good at dodge rolling, if you're not good at using your starting weapon, you're not going to get far in the game no matter what drops you get. It's one of the reasons why Enter the Gungeon is one of the more fairer action roguelikes and considered very highly on the list. With Dead Cells, you really don't have as much control over your run compared to some of the other games on the market, and the reason is that the weapons themselves were designed to be very unique in terms of their situational use and their utility. Getting the kicking boots gives you a completely different feel and completely different run compared to, say, the bleeding sword, or focusing on turrets, or focusing on grenades, or the heavy mallet, and so on and so forth. And that unpredictability is an essential part of roguelike design, but with Dead Cells' case, it makes it very hard to try and establish a game plan for how you approach a play. When we talk about kind of more quote-unquote modern roguelike and roguelite designs, it's about giving the player some malleability or some control over their progression. The easiest example, of course, is pick your reward after a run or a match. So this is what we see in Slay the Spire, Monster Train, Gunfire Reborn, and so on, where yes, I am choosing a random reward. I don't know what I'm going to get from a treasure chest or get after a match, but I can still push the variance or the unpredictability in a direction that suits my build. If in Slay the Spire, I already got 3 or 4 cards built around blocking, and then I get something like Juggernaut, or I think there's a few other cards. It's been a while since I played Slay the Spire. I can start tuning my deck when I see block-based cards show up. in Gunfire Reborn. If I am playing, I'm going for an elemental effect with the Prince. Well, once I start getting to the Golden Goblets and I see elemental drops, I can start to focus that. Are they going to show up every time? No. But the chance of me getting nothing throughout a run, I mean just completely, I have no build or strategy, is very low in these kinds of games. But with Dead Cells, the problem is that you really don't have a quote-unquote standard kit to then build your play off of. As anyone who's played Dead Cells knows, once you've started to unlock enough items, you're going to be able to get random starting melee, range, and shield or secondary base weapons. So in one hand, that gives you a completely different start. But it also makes it very hard to plan out what your strategy is going to be. Now, kind of the complete opposite of Dead Cells would be something like Hades, where in Hades, when your starting weapon or your starting aspect, that is going to rigidly define what your strategy is going to be for that run from minute 20, 30, 60, however long it takes for you to finish it. And I would argue that Hades does suffer also in terms of variance, or in terms of being able to kind of sculpt your run or get different elements in it because of how rigid the aspects are. But it does afford players more control. And as we've said before about roguelike design, it's not about making anything and everything could possibly happen. There needs to be some control. There has to be a baseline. Because if it is completely out of control, then the runs kind of lose all meaning. When one run can be a complete, kill everything, it's completely easy. Another run, you're just suffering, and there's no difference in between. Now, the other aspect that I think kind of hurts Dead Cells when it comes to weapon design or itemization is with being able to, again, fine-tune a build. And that means if you get something good, being able to cultivate it and keep pushing in that direction. As I said, with the examples of Slay the Spire and Gunfire Reborn, that if I get something that I like, if I start to see the semblance of a build, I can cultivate those specific elements so that even if I'm not finding more things, I can make those parts better. The obvious example from, say, the Spire and other deck builders is being able to upgrade the card, make your blocks better, make your starting attacks do more damage, so that if I'm not finding that perfect item that completely complements my build or the perfect card or weapon, I can still make do with what I have. It's not a wash if I'm still not finding good things. With Gunfire Reborn, the whole idea they're upgrading with the Craftsman is just that. If I have a really good illusion or a really good sniper, and I'm not finding anything else comparable level-wise, I can keep upgrading that weapon provided I have the gold for it. So that it's not a case that if the game refuses to drop something from my build, I'm completely in deep trouble. But with Dead Cells, it creates that issue where it's very hard, and sometimes just completely impossible, to sustain a build from beginning to end. And again, part of that is by the design and utility of the weapons. If, let's say, I get 2 really good starting turns, and I want to go for a turret or secondary base build, so I get my mutations for it, and I start to go around that. What often happens by, let's say, the 3rd to 4th level is that I'm not finding any new turrets. I'm not finding anything else I can complement this build. So what starts to happen is that my weapons or the actual turrets start to lose their utility. They're not doing enough damage. And then I'm left with a big choice. Do I keep pushing with this build that I've already gotten the mutations and trying to sync things around? Or do I try to go for the island of misfit toys and start trying to grab whatever weapon or whatever things that drop and hopefully try to make something work, even if it completely goes against the rest of my build? And the thing about Dead Cells, due to how the itemization works, it is often very difficult to get a build going. And there's two reasons for that. With the utility of the weapons, there's very little, I don't actually think there is any true carryover in terms of utility between weapons and what they can do. If we look at other games, if there's a weapon that does bleed, there may be 2 or 3 or even several more weapons that also will do bleed damage. So if, let's say, I want to run that build, I am not held to just a 1 out of 30 chance of getting that weapon. It could be maybe 4 or 5 out of 30, which may not sound all that amazing, but it is a very big deal. With Dead Cells, because each item is essentially a one-off, it makes it that much harder to get those different weapons. With the turn example, there are several turns in Dead Cells, but again, given the sheer number of weapons and items that have been added over the course of from early access to 1.0 through its DLCs, the chance or the probability that I'm going to get something that I truly need is very minuscule. And again, if you're trying to swap between different builds, it's very hard to get things going, especially if you are on the 4th or 5th level in a actual run. The other problem is how itemization works. With Dead Cells, as with other games that will procedurally build their weapons out of a loot table, you have different variables or modifiers and go into weapons. Weapon can cause an enemy to explode with poison. Weapon does more damage with bleed. Weapon will, spread ice or etc., etc. But the problem is that when there's just so many of them, again, it becomes next to impossible to get or control if you get a functional build. If, let's say, I have turrets that cause bleed, well, then I want weapons or other things that will have the modifiers that will proc or do more for bleed. The chance of that happening, though, again, considering how much is in the game, it's so low that you can't really factor that into a run. And what these issues cause is that Dead Cells features fixed bosses, as just about any other action roguelike will have. If you do not have an answer for their specific quirks or their specific abilities, the chance of you winning that run or even enjoying that run gets less and less. This is, again, like a counterpoint would be something like Monster Train. In Monster Train, you're always told what bosses you're going to fight, and your goal is to come up with an effective game plan so that I can start tweaking my build, or there are different answers to each boss. This is something that I talk about in Game Design Deep Dive Roguelikes, where a good methodology to build your choices around is how many answers do you have to the question of how do I beat this boss? If this boss is about, let's say, avoiding damage, how many solutions do we have for that? If it's about dealing enough damage, what are my solutions? And you want as many of them as you can. And more importantly, you need as many that are viable, that the player can try and build a strategy towards. Because again, if it's complete chaos and there's only, let's say, 2 ways of successfully beating this boss, the chance of that happening is going to be so few or so low that people aren't going to feel the motivation to keep playing, to hope that, 1 out of 500 runs, this will be the one that I win. And Dead Cells, unfortunately, just has too many items, and there's just too many variables in terms of trying to get a stable run. It's, again, one of the reasons why I really gravitate towards Monster Train or Slay the Spire, or even some of the more esoteric ones like Monolith, where I have a starting build or a starting strategy, and then either I will get more things to kind of add or enhance that, or I get something so amazing that I can then shift my strategy towards that new item. But it's never a case of, or it's very rarely will nothing work. That I have no starting good weapon, I get no starting or no good skills or cold scrolls, and I'm just 100% screwed. And with Dead Cells, I have that case where it just feels like nothing is happening, or that I will barely limp over the finish line to the final fight, and then the final fight will just crush me. And it feels like in many of these cases that I'm just not getting what I need to succeed. Now, speaking about getting what you need, that takes me to the second point that I want to discuss, and that is about the biome design and diversity of Dead Cells. Because Dead Cells is quite unique in how it's set up and framed in terms of progression. Unlike the other action roguelikes on the market, Dead Cells does have that Metroidvania aspect to it, that going through different biomes will get you unlocks, which in turn will allow you to go to different biomes. And then said biomes will have different blueprints and things that can happen that changes the course of your run. And choosing which biomes to go through in Dead Cells is a far more interesting decision, at least in that respect, compared to a lot of the other action roguelikes. Probably the closest comparison in terms of the framing of Dead Cells would be something like Monolith, that each stage is its own unique biome, with the enemies and bosses going to be distinct for that. Now, what makes Dead Cells different is that you're not fighting a boss after each stage. There's only a fixed number of boss fights in the game, and they occur usually after like 2 to 3 different biomes, give or take, depending upon where we're at in the game. Now, with each biome being its own unique space, again, this does set things up in terms of progression, that as you go forward, you're going to be fighting harder and more dangerous enemies, obviously. When you start getting into the boss cells progressive difficulty settings, they're going to start throwing harder enemies at you earlier. But the problem that Dead Cells has is that despite the differences in environmental designs and enemies, the biomes really don't, I would say, do anything from a roguelike perspective. One of the challenges of roguelike design is that there needs to be kind of a pattern to each stage. When you talk about something like the Binding of Isaac, I know in every Isaac level outside of once you beat the mom fight, that I'm going to get guaranteed 1 shop, 1 treasure, 1 boss. In Gunfire Reborn, I can reasonably assume on a level there's going to be a vault, there may be a craftsman, there may be a store or a shopkeeper, and I will always get a reward at the end of the stage in the form of the Golden Goblet. These kinds of set elements are used to define how a level is going to flow. I may not know what I'm going to get, but I have a good idea of what elements I can reasonably expect and plan around. With Dead Cells, I don't have that same feeling that I am getting things progressively better as I go from stage 1 to stage 2 and etc. And again, a lot of this stems from the itemization that Dead Cells has, with every weapon being very unique, and again, the randomized modifiers makes it very hard to guarantee, say, that at the end of stage 2, I'm going to be stronger in some capacity than I was at the beginning of stage 2. And this again makes it very hard to kind of give each stage that sense of, I guess, kind of a progressive growth in terms of what's happening. In a way, Dead Cells is kind of like Spelunky in this respect. That in Spelunky, you're not upgrading your character at the end of each stage. It's more about getting the items over the course of a run in order to prepare yourself for the final challenges. But with Spelunky, we are dealing with fixed knowns. There's not 20 different kinds of jetpacks or 30 different kinds of laser cannons. It's kept very minuscule because they want to make sure that you have a good chance at getting those items. Now, of course, if you're good at the game, you need fewer items in order to see it all or get further in it. But when we're dealing with the RPG abstraction in Dead Cells, that's a different story. The only thing that you can guarantee will grow your character in some respect are your 3 kind of stats, which are then correspond again to the different weapon and item types. But they always have diminishing returns. And again, it's not the same as getting a new modifier or changing ability or even getting a new card in a game like Slay the Spire, or again going back to the Gunfire Reborn examples. And the game is, again, despite the sheer number of items that show up in the game, there's very few that we could argue are kind of progression based. The different Metroidvania keys offer a short-term boost, but they're not really adding or changing your tech during combat. Again, with the different variables, they're only passively changing your damage and your health. And the only quote-unquote equipable you have is your kind of bracelet or that necklace that you wear. And even that doesn't really give you all that much. Again, because of the sheer number of modifiers, it's very hard to get everything working in unison. And the overall design of the biomes actually presents a very interesting issue that Dead Cells has. That despite the differences in the environment and what can show up, they lack any interesting events, or as we like to say, points of interest, that can radically change the scope of the run or the scope of the level. This is not the same as in a game like Gunfire, where a vault or a random demon invasion, or whatever they recoined it as, will all of a sudden add emphasis to that particular level. In Hades, the different choices that you make after each room will arguably change what that run is going to be. If I go for a specific buff, or a specific store, or whatever, that is affecting it. The Metroidvania aspect of Dead Cells, while it is highly touted, I think gets in the way of this. It's that classic issue of the mechanics kind of superseding the level design. That once you have your wall run and you start with a double jump, you have all this different movement tech, the levels can't really throw anything else to challenge you, outside of, again, just greatly raising the difficulty of the platforming and the obstacles, which would probably hurt a lot of people's ability to play the game. But when we look at other action roguelites, again, that the levels themselves have not only the set foundation, but they have these random elements that can change or mess with you. And Dead Cells simply just doesn't have that. In the Binding of Isaac, once you unlock the harder difficulty and you get more elite variations and things along those lines, you're not able to just go on autopilot. In a lot of the Dead Cells plays, it just feels like you can just run past mostly everything and only stop for a few important elements. And while it is certainly a viable strategy, I would just like to have more ways of progressing. And I think one area where Dead Cells could have probably have improved on, maybe even just taken some notes from other action roguelikes, is giving the player an option of focusing on their progression. As in being able to maybe permanently upgrade a weapon to +1 or add a modifier that would last for the run. And beyond just the guy at the end of each stage, or when you go back to kind of the dropping your cells off. Because even that is very limited. And it actually takes me to another issue that I have with the game. That Dead Cells tries to have its cake and eat it too, in terms of persistence. On one hand, this is an action roguelike where runs don't carry over. Except they do. And this is done in the form of gold, and of course, as we said, the unlocking of new gear using your cells. At this point, I just do not like the gold system in Dead Cells. Gold is used at the shops to buy more items, and you can use it to upgrade your weapon or just add a plus to it, which is kind of like raising the rarity of it at the end or before you start each new stage. But the thing is that gold is persistent, and the game is balanced on that fact. So it's kind of like you'll start a run, you'll kill the enemies, you'll come to a shop, and they'll ask you for like 8,000 to 10,000 for an item, and you may only be at several hundred or maybe 1 to 2,000. And I feel that level of persistence kind of gets in the way again of the player being able to be the masters of their own destiny. Because being able to upgrade your weapon or go to the shop and get stuff like that is how you're supposed to be able to kind of define your own sense of progression. But if you don't have the money for it, even if you kill everything, you're not able to make use of it. And the treasure chests themselves will only give you one reward. There are a few places where you'll be able to make a choice, but if you're going to a treasure chest, it's always one thing. And again, I just feel like there's way too many elements that get in the way or keep you from creating a game plan that give it that same sense of progression that we've seen from other action roguelikes, and even just traditional roguelikes in the space. So to wrap up our Dissecting design, as I said, Dead Cells is by no means a bad game. It has amazing moment-to-moment gameplay, variety of weapons, really great aesthetics as well, and the game has been supported with multiple DLCs, both free and paid. But when I think about action roguelikes and the importance of variance, and just being able to have that sense of different viable runs each time I play, I just feel like Dead Cells is one of the lower ends, or even just one of the worst examples of it. And when people ask me, what are my favorite action roguelikes and roguelites and stuff like that, I just cannot put Dead Cells on the list because of it. And it is such a different take on this design. And if the developers do decide to push forward either with more game-changing DLC or even a sequel at some point, I would love for them to kind of really emphasize the kind of Metroidvania aspects more. Give the player more abilities. Let them branch out more into the space and make it actually matter. Such as having, let's say, a unique progression option that only shows up in a specific biome. And I think that could be something that could also add to the level of variance and progression in Dead Cells as is. Because like I said, each biome in of itself, it's not factoring into the progression. Because the progression aspects of the game, the cells, your stats, and the gear, are universal. Let me find something in the gardens, let's say if I go that route, that maybe lets me do some special ability for that run. Or if I decide to go the route of the sewers, maybe I get something that gives me partial health regeneration. Again, major elements that provide variance and kind of a quote-unquote spikiness, but I, as the player, have to decide whether or not to engage in those points, and what do I give up in response to it. And I think those things would add more diversity to the game and give you a better or a greater reason to push forward into the higher difficulties with having more and more viable ways of playing, as opposed to kind of the hope and the prayer that everything kind of works out, the game just, the RNG is in your favor. But with that said, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm expecting a lot of polarized thoughts on this, much like my Spelunky piece. And I think there's going to be a lot more of a split between people who really, really love Dead Cells and those who maybe, admire it from afar but don't necessarily play it as much. And with that said, if you are interested in seeing more Dissecting designs here on the channel, I do have that set up as a Patreon goal to try and do these monthly. Otherwise, I kind of do them when the mood strikes me. Do all the liking and subscribing. Check out the Discord as well, link down below. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.